Contrary to popular belief, the 80 Chicago Bulls had more than one hobby, and they actually fielded some talent on the court before Michael Jordan got there, with the best known player being Artis Gilmore. But the fan favorite before Jordan's arrival was smooth as butter and dipped in butter. Reggie Theus was a flashy combo guard before combo guards were popular, who combined effortless scoring with flashy passing to give Bulls fans something to cheer about in the early 80s. Yet after an all-star season, Theus was inexplicably left to rot on the bench, but he took it all in stride and eventually got out of Chicago via trade and proceeded to put up consistent numbers in multiple stops over the rest of his career, while unknowingly putting a target on his back for a young Michael Jordan. But Reggie Theus was one of the first true combo guards, and bad teams or not, the scoring and passing numbers that he put up together had rarely been seen. Let's jog your memory. Reggie Theus spent his youth in Inglewood, California, eventually attending Inglewood High, where his talent was never in question, with his high school coach even referring to him as a once-in-a-lifetime type of player, as he would play in front of sold-out crowds at every game. And by the time he was a senior, the 6'6" forward with guard skills was looked at as the most complete player in the state of California, and would back that up with averages of 24.5 points, 15 rebounds, 8 assists, and 3 steals per game, en route to being named a first-team All-CIF member. And then in the spring of his senior year, it was announced that he signed a letter of intent with UNLV. And while his basketball dream was coming to fruition, he sadly wouldn't be able to share his accomplishments with his father, as he had passed away unexpectedly prior to Theus' senior season. For a long time, UNLV had little reputation for their basketball, but that had changed recently, as they had brought in head coach Jerry Tarkanian a couple seasons prior, and Tarkanian employed a relentless pressing defense with an up-tempo offense, as the combination of the two would lead to the birth of the Runnin Rebels, with the first iteration coming during Theus' time at UNLV. But Theus would have to earn his place on the team, as he was coming off the bench during his freshman season, and wasn't looked to for much scoring, but he would finish second on the team in assists, and there'd be a lot of assists, as UNLV was the highest scoring team in the nation, and with that came a lot of winning, as they would start the season with a 20-game win streak, and overall lose just one regular season game, as they were given a tournament bid to take on Boise State in round 1, a game which they would win easily, as Theus chipped in 6 points. But the Sweet 16 saw them upset in overtime by Arizona, as Theus' freshman year wrapped up with him averaging about 6 points, 4.5 assists, and half a steal per game. It was the same look Rebels in 1977 with a lot of star seniors, such as forwards Eddie Owens and Sam Smith. But now Theus was spending a lot more time on the court, getting over 25 minutes per game, and while he maintained his good assist numbers, he upped his scoring to over 14 points per game, as an important contributor to the nation's top-ranked offense. And while they would double their regular season loss total from last year with a whopping 2 defeats in 77, they were still looked at as one of the nation's top contenders, with Theus playing a huge role in their tournament run. A convincing first-round win over USF was all Theus, as he would finish with a game-high 27 points along with 8 rebounds off the bench. He cooled off in the Sweet 16 versus Utah, but still chipped in 14 points as the Rebels outlasted the Utes. Next was Idaho State, as Theus contributed 16 points and 6 assists, and UNLV ran away with it in the second half, as they were heading to a Final Four matchup with North Carolina. But Theus would turn in his worst game of the tournament, recording just 8 points, and with North Carolina shooting nearly 60% from the field and slowing down the Rebels, they were able to hold on and win by a point. And while it wasn't the game they were hoping to play in, Theus would go for 23 points and 8 assists in a win over UNC Charlotte 2 nights later in the national third-place game. And overall, Theus' season had seen him average about 14.5 points, 4.5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. UNLV lost a lot of their top players to graduation, but still fielded a strong roster, with one of the nation's best backcourts, featuring Theus and guard Tony Smith. And while they remained one of the nation's highest scoring teams, with Theus leading the charge as their top scorer, they averaged nearly 20 points less than last year, due to a much weaker bench. But it didn't really look like a problem, as about halfway through the season, the Rebels were undefeated at 13-0. But a loss to New Mexico in the first game of the new year kicked off a collapse for the Rebels, as they would drop 5 of their next 6, and overall would finish the year with a 20-8 record. And while you would think that a team that made the Final Four last year would still get a tournament bid, that wouldn't be the case, as in what would be the beginning of years of NCAA investigations on Tarkanian and the UNLV program, the Rebels would serve the first of a 2-year probation this season. So their year was done, as Theus ended the season with averages of about 19 points, 7 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. But Theus was coming off his best season, and with another year of probation coming up, there was no reason for him to return, so the junior guard would declare for the NBA draft. Theus would come off the bench with the 9th pick and join a Chicago Bulls team who were strong in the front court, with forward Mickey Johnson and future Hall of Famer and franchise player Artis Gilmore. But their backcourt was weak, and Theus had the size and scoring ability to play the 2 guard, but also showed in college that he was a capable point guard, which is where the Bulls would play him out of necessity. And even though Theus wasn't on the same level defensively as he was offensively, he felt very confident about the future of the team after his addition. Theus would become a day 1 starter, as he would start all 82 games as a rookie, and he looked like a natural, as he was scoring very well for the team, trailing only Gilmore in that category, and was the team's best distributor, even dishing 15 assists in an early season win over Indiana. And while he brought that fast-paced UNLV play style to the NBA with him, he found out quickly that the margin of error was much smaller, as he could get ahead of himself, which led to him committing nearly 4 turnovers per game. And even though Theus was putting up some good numbers, the Bulls got off to a nightmare start, losing 10 of their first 11. And once they got to 20-36, they replaced head coach Larry Costello with Scottie Robertson. And while they would show some improvement, it's hard to win games when you're the lowest scoring offense in the league, as they would finish with a 31-51 record. But Theus would receive a first-team all-rookie selection and finish second in Rookie of the Year voting, behind averages of about 16.5 points, 5 assists, and a steal per game. The Bulls looked a lot different come the beginning of the following season. Theus and Gilmore were still there and set to be the focal points, but Johnson was gone, and the Bulls had drafted Dave Greenwood as his replacement. And as compensation for Johnson going to the Pacers, the Bulls got guard Ricky Sobers in return. But probably the biggest addition was the man at the end of the bench, as they promoted former franchise star Jerry Sloan from assistant to head coach. And while it was clear that Theus was likely best suited to play shooting guard, bringing in Sobers just led to more backcourt confusion, as neither of them were natural point guards. But with Theus knowing the offense, he would again spend a lot of time as a facilitator. And while he upped his assist numbers, his career-high 348 turnovers would be the second most in the league. And with the NBA introducing the three-point line, Theus, who was known as a good shooter, would routinely be among the league leaders in three-point attempts over the next few years. But his range didn't seem to extend that far, as a career 25% shooter from deep. But Theus did a bit of everything for the Bulls, finishing top 2 in points, assists, and steals, as well as pulling down a career-high 4 rebounds per game. Yet the Bulls would lean on him more than initially expected, as Gilmore would miss nearly half the season. But Chicago fell victim to the same problem that they did last year, a horrible start to the season that they couldn't come back from, as with the team being mostly without Gilmore until January, they would manage just a 12-25 record prior to the new year. And it was a positive that Theus was producing at the same level, even after Gilmore came back. But while the offense was there for Theus, the Bulls' offense as a whole didn't show much improvement, while their defense regressed, and Gilmore's return didn't save them, as they finished with a 30-52 record and missed the playoffs, as year 2 had seen Theus average about 20 points, 6.5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. But come year 3, Theus would look like he was on the verge of stardom. The Bulls tried to address their defense by adding Larry Keenan, and with Gilmore playing all season, they would allow 3 less points per game, and their offense would be in the top half of the league. And Theus was the man that made the offense go, as he returned to being the team's full-time point guard and turned in one of the greatest seasons of his career.
Reggie Theus probably was as good as any guard in the league at being able to penetrate on the drive.
Even with a healthy Gilmore, Theus remained the team's leading scorer, while continuing as their best distributor, and he was as efficient as he had ever been, shooting a career-high 49.5% from the field and committing 1 less turnover per game. And the success was coming, as not only were the Bulls stringing some wins together, they were also beating some legit opponents. And Theus was getting some league-wide recognition with the Bulls winning, as he would be voted to his first career All-Star game, and would even be a starter. But the nerves were there.
As we start this game from the Richfield Coliseum, glad to have you with us. This is Reggie Theus, his first All-Star appearance. He might be a little nervous in the early going.
However, he would recover to score 8 points in an Eastern Conference win. The rest of the season saw the Bulls fighting to remain in the playoff picture, but they caught fire at the right time, winning 13 of their final 15, which included an 8-game win streak to end the season, as they made their return to the playoffs for the first time in 5 years. And they were hot going into their first round series with New York. Yet the Knicks were still the favorite, but the Bulls had other ideas. And after Theus put up modest numbers in a Game 1 win, he put the team on his back in Game 2, going for 37 points and 11 assists in an overtime win, as the sweep was complete, and a beat-up Bulls team were moving on to face the Celtics. Theus and the Bulls lost a high-scoring affair in Game 1 as Theus struggled, but then over the next 2, he would have a great all-around offensive showing, averaging 23.5 points and 6 assists, while shooting over 56% from the field, and committing 3 total turnovers in those 2 games. But the Bulls had no answer for a Celtics team trying to neutralize Gilmore by playing an up-tempo style, as they had fallen behind 3-0. Then with their season on the line, Theus turned in a disappointing 12 points on 4 of 14 shooting, as a huge performance from Larry Bird closed them out in a sweep, with Theus' All-Star season ending with him averaging about 19 points, 5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. Unfortunately for Chicago, once the following year began, it made their 81 season look like an outlier, and the team's offense and defense took a noticeable hit. For Theus in year 4, he was doing his usual work, acting as one of the team's top scorers while again being their top assist man, but it wasn't translating into winning like last year. And after winning just 19 of their first 51 games, Chicago fired Sloan, as it was reported that there was tension growing among him and the players, as he had a very strict game plan on offense. So soon after he was gone, Team GM Rod Thorne would fill in for the rest of the season. And while the Bulls would show some improvement as they went 500 in their final 30 games under Thorne, the damage was already done, and a 34-48 record wouldn't get them a return to the playoffs, as Theus' season had seen him average about 18.5 points, 6 assists, and a steal per game. Then over the offseason, the Bulls brought in Paul Westhead, who was known for his up-tempo offense, an offensive play style that Theus had excelled in at UNLV, and while he would excel again, would it lead to the same success that he had in college? But something was very different. The team looked smaller, and they were, as they had traded Gilmore to the Spurs. As with the team set to push the pace, an aging, less mobile Gilmore didn't make a lot of sense. And with him gone, Theus would take on the bulk of the scoring load, yet he would get some extra help from rookie guard Quinton Daly and second-year forward Orlando Woolridge. So with the team playing at a top 5 pace, their scoring jumped, as Theus would be a top 10 scorer in the league on a career-high average. But with the ball in his hands more than ever, he jumped back up to having one of the highest turnover totals in the league. But the numbers were looking good, and Theus had a flash and flair to his game, which helped him earn his second All-Star selection. Yet this time he would fail to score. However, when the Bulls came out of the All-Star break, they were fighting to stay alive at 17-34, and the winning would become less frequent as the season went on, with the Bulls winning just 2 of their final 10 games, as one of the league's worst defensive teams, and finishing the year at 28-54, with Theus' second All-Star campaign seeing him average about 24 points, 6 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. Yet the Bulls went for another coach going into the 84 season, but this would mark the beginning of the end of Theus' time in Chicago. Going into the 1984 season, the Chicago Bulls hired Kevin Loughery, as he inherited a team whose best player was a 60-year Reggie Theus, coming off an All-Star season. Yet even though Theus had been a model professional and starter who hadn't missed a game since entering the league, Loughery completely cut his minutes and brought him off the bench from the beginning of the season, as Theus went from averaging nearly 24 points in 83 to less than 9 points in 84. And even though fans were pleading for Theus to play, Loughery remained firm on the benching, as he employed an aggressive trapping-style defense, and the offensive-minded Theus didn't fit his game plan. And Theus was already in the doghouse with Loughery, after staging a contract holdout for most of training camp. And while Laughery would start him briefly in late November, he would later reveal that it was only due to owner pressure. And then just a couple weeks later, Theus would log a DMP in a win over Milwaukee, which broke his streak of 429 consecutive games played. Then after receiving very limited minutes over the next 2 months, the Chicago fan favorite was finally freed, as he was shipped to the Kings. And before I go on, there's a story out there that Reggie Theus at some point said that no rookie could replace him in Chicago, referring to Michael Jordan, after Theus was traded from Chicago the year before they drafted Jordan. And that Jordan responded by telling his friend and former college teammate Kenny Smith to tell Theus that he was going to give him 45, then proceeding to give him 43. But there's some discrepancies in this story. Jordan did give the Kings 43 on February 16, 1987, and while Kenny Smith would spend the early years of his NBA career on the Kings, at this time, he was still completing his senior season at North Carolina, as he and Theus would only spend 1 season on the Kings together, which was the following year. But it looks like Jordan really held a grudge, as nearly a year from the day, on February 19, 1988, he dropped 49 points on the Kings. So either way, it seemed like Jordan took that personally. But now Theus had a fresh start on a Kings team who played at a pace much more suited for his game. And with a great scorer on the wing in Eddie Johnson, the Kings definitely had some producers on the offensive end. And Theus returned to a starting role, splitting his time between point guard and shooting guard. Yet the Kings were in a similar position as the Bulls. Not really a playoff team, but also not one of the worst teams, as they were sitting at 22-30 when Theus arrived. And over their final 30 games, Theus really saw his assist numbers climb, averaging 7 per game, and the Kings would go 16-14 to close out the season. And at 38-44, they were able to capture the final playoff spot in the West and get a matchup with the Lakers. And overall, Theus would put up some solid all-around numbers, as he averaged about 14, 5, and 5 for the series. Yet he had shot poorly over the first 2 games. Then even though he came out with an efficient 22 points in Game 3, the Lakers would get the win, which marked their third of the series, as they completed the sweep, as Theus' overall season had seen him average about 12 points, 6 assists, and a steal per game. So Theus would get a full year in Kansas City for the 85 season. But one thing he couldn't seem to escape was coaching instability, as after going through 7 coaches during his time in Chicago, he would bring his overall career total to 10 by the end of this season, as Kansas City went through 2 different coaches this year after Cotton Fitzsimmons left for San Antonio after last season. The Kings had a lot of good pieces, as outside of Johnson and Theus, they also had Larry Drew, a great 6th man in Mike Woodson, and rookie forward Otis Thorpe. And Theus' time as a King would see him transition to more of a distributor. He was still a big contributor in the scoring column as the team's 3rd leading scorer, but his then career-high 8 assists per game would lead the team and be a top 10 mark in the league. And while the Kings continued to run up the score with their fast-paced offense, much like for most of Theus' time in Chicago, defense was an afterthought, as they finished bottom 3 in points allowed. So while the game plan continued to cater to a style of play that Theus excelled in, it had rarely translated to winning for the now 7-year pro, as this season saw the Kings finish at 31-51 and miss the playoffs, with Theus putting up averages of about 16.5 points, 8 assists, and a steal per game. But with the Kings making a move to Sacramento following the season, it was a chance for the franchise to turn over a new leaf. The now Sacramento Kings would roll out Reggie Theus as their full-time starting point guard during the 86 season, and he responded with arguably the best point guard season of his career. He finished as the team's 2nd leading scorer, as at this point you could pretty much guarantee about 18 points a night from Riverboat Reg. But as the offense slowed down, Theus was able to split up his assists between the half-court game and transition. Yet ball security continued to plague him, as he would commit the 2nd most turnovers in the league. But his assists were as high as they would ever be, as his 9.6 per game were a top 3 mark in the league, with Theus recording 37 double-doubles this season, including dishing a career-high 18 assists on 3 different occasions. And the Kings weren't great, but they were average on both sides of the ball. And while it wasn't pretty, their 37-45 record was enough for the 7th seed in the West, and a first-round matchup with the heavily favored Rockets. But this series would go about as expected, as the Rockets pulled off a pretty easy sweep of the Kings. And although Theus averaged about 15 points and 6 assists, it wasn't without its mistakes, as he shot below 40% and averaged nearly 5 turnovers per game, with Theus's playoff season ending with him averaging about 18.5 points, 9.5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. The 87 Kings would field an impressive offense, as they had 3 players averaging at least 18 points, with Theus leading the way by putting up his highest scoring average since his final All-Star year in Chicago, but he remained the team's best distributor, averaging nearly 9 per game to finish in the league's top 10 for the 3rd straight season. But the Kings as a whole weren't really striking fear into any teams, and as the season wore on, the losses were again piling up, until an early February loss, which marked the 5th of 6 straight, led to the Kings moving on from head coach Phil Johnson and replacing him with Jerry Reynolds, marking the 11th coach of Theus's career. And while they would improve slightly under Reynolds, they had already dug too deep of a hole, finishing with a 29-53 record and failing to return to the playoffs, as Theus's year had ended with him averaging about 20.5 points, 9 assists, and a steal per game. Coach number 12 of Theus's now decade-long career would be an NBA legend, as the Kings would bring in 11-time champion Bill Russell, and the earlier mentioned Kenny Smith would join the team as their first-round draft pick, as he, Theus, and Thorpe would make up the majority of the team's offense. And with the team losing some of their scoring from last year, Theus would readjust into more of a scoring role, as his 21.3 points per game were the second most of his career. And for the first time in years, he wouldn't lead his team in assists, yet would still average over 6 per game. But unfortunately for the Kings, Russell couldn't suit up for them, as their bottom 3 defense could have used him. Yet after a 17-41 start, the Kings decided they no longer had a use for him, as he was dismissed, and Jerry Reynolds was back, as he assumed his former position. But it was another lost cause season, as they won just 7 more games the rest of the year to finish at 24-58, as Theus ended his year with averages of about 21.5 points, 6.5 assists, and a steal per game. So after 4 years and change, the team hadn't made any progress, and it seemed that both parties knew it was time to move on. So Theus would be traded to the Atlanta Hawks, as he would say that the one thing that had eluded him in his career was winning, and he felt that Atlanta was a team that had the talent to be great. And looking at their roster, it was hard to disagree, as although they were aging, they featured longtime franchise star Dominique Wilkins, and were clearly trying to win now, as they brought in former MVP Moses Malone over the offseason as well. However, they were missing one big piece, as a foot injury left the Hawks without big man Kevin Willis all season. But what Theus provided them was a shooting guard, and some extra scoring that they badly needed. And with a proven point guard in Doc Rivers, Theus would actually get to play mostly at shooting guard this season. And while he would take a backseat to Wilkins and Malone, he still slotted in as a great complementary scorer, giving slightly watered-down versions of his usual numbers, while recording a career low for turnovers. And Theus would finally experience some winning, as the Hawks were able to string together 52 wins, marking the first 50-win season of Theus's career, as he looked to have a legit chance at some playoff success going into a first-round matchup with Milwaukee. But with his best chance at a ring, Theus had the worst postseason performance of his career, as although the Bucks and Hawks played a back-and-forth series that went the distance, Theus rarely had a big impact, as he only averaged about 7.5 points on less than 40% shooting. And while his assist numbers were solid at nearly 5 per game, he really struggled on the defensive side of the ball. And in the end, the Hawks came up short in Game 5, losing by 4 to end their season, with Theus's season in Atlanta seeing him average about 16 points, 4.5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. But apparently Theus hadn't done enough to keep the Hawks interested, as with 2 new teams set to enter the league next season, they left Theus unprotected for the expansion draft. In mid-June, Theus would be the second player chosen by the Orlando Magic in the 1989 expansion draft, as the veteran Theus gave them someone to lean on when they needed scoring, in what would understandably be a year full of growing pains for the new team. So Theus would spend his first season in Orlando acting as the team's second leading scorer and distributor, yet would see his field goal percentage drop to one of the lowest marks of his career, as he was averaging one of his highest shot totals in years, yet also being most teams' main defensive focus. And the stats also came for Theus, as he once again found himself playing fast-paced basketball, with little emphasis on defense. And this would only lead to 18 wins, as Theus wrapped up his expansion season with averages of about 19 points, 5.5 assists, and a steal per game. But a young Magic team looking for future assets shipped Theus to the Nets for a second-round pick after the season, as a 33-year-old Theus would join a young, high-potential Nets team, once again providing some crafty scoring and shot creating as their leading scorer this season. But while Theus continued putting up some great numbers, well over a decade into his career, it had never translated into much winning for the now 13-year pro, and that theme wouldn't change this year, as the Nets would finish at 26-56 and miss the playoffs, with Theus averaging about 18.5 points, 4.5 assists, and a steal per game. But after years of consistent play, Theus's NBA career quietly came to an end. However, he wouldn't be done with professional basketball at all, as he spent the next 2 seasons playing off and on in Europe. Then in the mid-2000s, he returned to basketball as a coach at New Mexico, and eventually spent a year coaching the Sacramento Kings. Reggie Theus is another one of those guys who put up good numbers on bad teams. But they weren't just your regular good numbers, as there were few players who could score and pass like he could, especially at his size. And while his mainstream popularity never really reached that next level due to his lack of team success, he was very popular on the teams he played for, especially in Chicago, where he may have been remembered more fondly among the average fan, if not for Michael Jordan joining the team immediately after his departure. But then you also have to take into account how unfairly he was treated, as he did not deserve the exile on the bench at the end of his Bulls tenure. Yet he remained a positive locker room presence through it all. And while tall combo guards are normal nowadays, some of the only guys putting up better scoring and passing numbers at Theus's size during Theus's time were Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. So that's saying something. But that's it for today's episode on Reggie Theus. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Chicago Bulls teammates, or this one on one of his Nets teammates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.